Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victoria Kirilloff. I am a certified divorce financial analyst, and I am joined with Lisa Zonder, who is a family attorney as well as a family mediator. Our goal for you today is to learn about the financial infidelities and really how you can remedy that as a part of your divorce. Before we dive into the details, I always like to begin with a little bit about who I am, and Lisa will introduce herself as well. But long story short, I did not grow up thinking I would become a divorce financial analyst. I went through my own very painful narcissistic marriage and subsequent divorce, and that is how I then found the field of financial analysis. I essentially made a divorce impact analysis report for my marriage, and I used that to really navigate the uncoupling phase, which then enabled me to kind of get known around town for that. And my friends started to ask me to help them with their divorces. And here I am 8 years later, the founder of Divorce Analytics, where we help you replace your divorce fear with financial facts. Lisa?
Hi, so hello and welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Victoria. Thank you so much for sharing your personal background information. So I just want to reiterate, because from my perspective as an attorney today, what I'm going to be focusing on is, I know we're talking about financial infidelity in divorce, but I'm going to be focusing a lens on the fiduciary responsibilities and implications in California divorce when there is a breach of those fiduciary duties. And I'll introduce myself as well. So I'm Lisa Zonder of Zonder Family Law Group, and I am a family lawyer in private practice for over 30 years. I am also a certified family law specialist, certified by the State Bar of California, Board of Legal Specialization. As part of my practice, I am also a family law mediator. I'm collaboratively trained. And my passion is resolving conflict out of court. And so in doing that, normally my clients would be looking to mediation or negotiation. And I want to make the point here, Victoria, before we get started, that even these complex cases that we have can be resolved using out-of-court options. I've assisted couples with a lot of financial infidelity to resolve their cases out of court. And to also make that point that typically no one wants to air dirty laundry in public. So they might consider a private mediator or negotiation out of court. And finally, as an attorney, I'd want to make the point that my presentation today strictly pertains to California and is just for general educational information. I know Victoria is going to give us a little bit more about the disclaimers.
Thank you so much, Lisa. With that, I am going to share my screen and we can kind of dive into all the details. Okay. Well, in our presentation, How to Fight Financial Infidelity in Divorce, we will be talking about a California case. However, this is a webinar, and so we might have people from all around the different states. So please consult with your legal and tax professional and financial professional in your state before you actually take action. This is specifically so you can get informed and become educated. Because if you do not have the education, you can't build your legal team to really help you figure out how to deal with this complex matter.
Yeah, and Victoria, if you're done with the disclaimers, thank you for that. I just also want to give a little bit of a shout out and acknowledgement to all of those families in Los Angeles, in the Southern California region, dealing with the devastating fires here. Our hearts go out to all of the people who have either lost homes or family members. It's more touching and devastating to us than we ever expected or imagined. So prayers for safety. Again, it's affected many of us, friends, people we know, people we work with, family members. So I just want to, put that out there, Victoria, so that people realize that we are sensitive to the fact that some people may not be able to join us today because they're luckily, I think most of us have power restored at this point, but a lot of people have been displaced in Southern California.
It is truly shocking to see all the devastation, and life is hard enough to rebuild, let alone when you have the additional stressors of, losing everything. It can be very overwhelming. So our hearts and minds are with them.
Yeah, and one more point, Victoria, if I may, is just to say that I'm not a crypto expert, and frequently attorneys collaborate with outside financial professionals and in other industries for different things like business valuations, like expertise that you're bringing today to the table. So oftentimes when we have emerging areas like cryptocurrency, and it's technical and it's outside of the realm of what most attorneys are experts in. And so we often collaborate with experts. So I'm glad that we're able to do this together today.
Absolutely. And I think that is an excellent point, Lisa. People are not aware that divorce is really a four-phase event. There's an emotional and social side that you work with your divorce coach or your therapist to really navigate. But where rubber hits the road is really in the financial phase. And that's where you can save yourself a lot of time, effort, and energy if you're working with a certified divorce financial analyst, to really build out your financial discovery, to prepare the financial affidavits, and then develop a global settlement proposal. So you actually can go to the next phase, the legal and negotiation phase, with all of your financial facts in order. This is cryptocurrency is fascinating, and it is just one area of financial infidelity. There is a whole host of other things that can occur in a marriage, and we'll go into that a little later. But it's very important that as you are facing this, you truly build out a financial analysis that is going to help you educate not only your attorney, but then probably your opposing party's attorney as well in this matter, because you're really having the burden of making the claim. And this is only going to be able to be done through financial documentation. So with that said, let us roll into the very beginning. Back when you guys got married, right? When you submitted your documentation to the courthouse, you got that marriage certificate. And that was really the beginning of the marriage corporation. Now, Lisa, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's a great point. So, right. So marriage bestows on it different obligations. When you are married, you're forming a financial partnership, a spiritual partnership, a legal partnership, an emotional partnership. And so we focus our lens now on the fiduciary duties. So they're critical to know about. So if you mismanage, for example, your financial duties, you could end up in, like, for example, let's examine how risky investments can harm the community property during the divorce and how that might be waste. But how does that come about? It comes about because there's a Family Code 721B confidential relationship. Well, what does that mean? It means that there's basically a duty of highest good faith and fair dealing for each spouse, and neither one is allowed to take advantage of the other. And, risky investments obviously are something to be looked at under a microscope here today, because how are you dealing? Are you in good faith? Are you in fair dealing? What is a waste of assets? And these breaches can occur in different contexts. So, for example, it could be a result of gambling, could be that you're hiding assets. It could be that when you're purchasing cryptocurrency or NFTs and tokens, that the investments might rise to the level of a breach. And so it kind of begs the question, right? So how does this even give us context in the context of divorce? How does this even work? So we're talking about California's community property laws that, thank you for that slide. And so the laws in California, and these are general rules, this is general educational information because there could be lots of exceptions, right, to things, but establish that nearly all the assets and debts accumulated during the marriage are characterized as community property. And so with that, there are some exceptions, right, as we say on the slide. It could be that you have the property or the money from before marriage and you're investing in crypto. We're not talking about that today because if you invested your own money, from before marriage and you didn't include your spouse and the spouse didn't want to be included in the investment, that's probably off the table and not the focus of what we're talking about today. Also, some people have premarital agreements or postmarital agreements made during marriage. And in those instances, right, there may be specific ideas around what investments can be made, or it could even just be simply that each is keeping his or her own property as separate properties. So depending on if you opted out of the California scheme, this could look different depending on whether you're in the California community property scheme with joint property or if you're outside of it. And so on the next slide, what we talk about is, what is, I like the way Victoria framed this, the operating agreement of the marriage. So what sort of governs how you need to be in relationship to your spouse when it comes to managing and controlling the property, right? So California Family Code 1100 is the operative law that we're looking at, the statute that we're looking at now. And in that, it says that both parties have equal rights in managing the community property. So this is a legal framework that also imposes a strict duty to disclose any and all relevant facts about community assets. So all material facts and information need to be disclosed to the spouse. And what happens if you fail to adhere to these requirements, it can lead to legal disputes and penalties. And so what we want to emphasize here is the importance of transparency in your marital financial dealings. I also want to take a minute here. I'm not going to go into depth here because I know no one's looking for legal citations specifically. But in terms of these marital obligations from one to the other, there is a case that's called Marriage of Kamgar, and I'm only going to give you a sentence or two on it. So I don't want to have people glaze over, on like, oh, I don't want to start studying the law. It's fine. But just to know that there was an options trader, Mr. Kamgar, and he exceeded what was the agreed upon investment that he and Mrs. Kamgar came up with. So they had an agreed upon investment limit. And whatever the number is, I don't want to get into the details now because then I'm going to get too into the weeds, but the court found that Mr. Kamgar, when he kept taking more money out than they agreed to, and he kept going with his options trading, he basically breached his fiduciary duty to his wife. And so she made a claim in the divorce context, and she was awarded 1/2 of the losses that he sustained. He ended up spending over $8 million, and in the account by the time the divorce was was decided, she was left with 400,000-ish, and she said, wait a minute, that's not okay. So Victoria will get into that in more depth as we go later on, but to mention right here, tying it back to Family Code 1100, you might have an equal management and control right, but you do have the highest obligation of good faith dealings. And if you're not going to disclose to your spouse or get consent and be loyal in those same ways that the corporation code requires, there will be consequences of that breach. And again, you could potentially find yourself like and I'm just going to say this very quickly, the marriage of Rossi, there was a lottery case where the court ended up awarding all of the undisclosed lottery winnings to the spouse who didn't even know that their monies were invested in the lottery, and no disclosure was made, by the way, when the lottery monies were won. So in that case, also consequences of the breach, that's just the point that I'm making here. So you want to take care to be aware of these obligations and the consequences.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that a lot of the times in marriages, especially ones that have some financial infidelity, there is a financial narrative that, my money is my money and your money is my money as well. And so oftentimes the transgressor spouse will have a lot of negative behaviors and a lot of defensive language that they will say, well, this is my account, this is my money. And oftentimes my clients come to me still with that same mindset. And so you have to kind of get outside of, unless it was documented, all of the money that was earned during the marriage is community property. And unless you have a prenup that states otherwise, you have to really totally value the marital estate and then divide it from that point. But working with a divorce coach is especially instrumental when you are dealing with these high level emotional issues, because there's so many underlying dynamics that we have to contend with.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as well, we need to be thinking about what else is not being disclosed in the marriage. If you find that there is some financial infidelity around cryptocurrency, kind of eyes wide open is what I would say there, is just kind of be very well aware of, because if, there's a lack of trust and you have reason, and a lot of times I think the spouse also feels like they can take more ground. So like I was just thinking, Victoria, what you were saying in Camgar, it's possible that Mr. Camgar thought, well, my wife agreed that I could spend 2.5 million as I wanted, and I'm just gonna, take more ground here and just keep going on it, because if she let me do this much, I'll keep going and maybe she won't notice and I'll just tell her they were losses. So the narrative in the end looks like, well, we sustained losses, but the whole story isn't there. So I think that's where it's really critical to have a financial expert to be able to comb through that and see what's really underneath the hood of what's being presented. And I know you'll get into that a little more later. So let's go to the exceptions to equal division. So as a general proposition, the courts are obligated to, again, and we're not talking about if there's a person who's in a prenup or a or a postmarital agreement. So prenups or postmarital agreements would be off the table. We're not discussing those because they may have opted out of the community scheme. But as a general proposition, the court's going to divide all property that is community equally. And so, well, how do you then look at the $400,000 left in the Camgar account as an example and not just simply divide it equally? It's because there is authority, case law, and statutory law that allows the court to look at an unequal division, and that happens under Family Code, I think 2625, where all of the debts could be. Why do I say 2641? Oh, that's the educational debts. Yeah, and 2625 is the exception, and there it says that all separate debts, including those incurred by a spouse during marriage and before date of separation that were not incurred for the benefit of the community, shall be confirmed without offset to the spouse who incurred the debt. So in that instance, you would have to show the court that these debts or investments weren't made for the benefit of the community. And so we have an ability to argue for an unequal division, but we must show that they were not for the benefit of community. And then, so for example, what would you do if your spouse was gambling or sports betting or lost a ton of money by some other risky investment, which is what we're talking about here? What if they invested all their money in, prostitution and other things that did not benefit the marriage? So with those, we'll go into, so what is financial infidelity? Let's see where we are in our next slide. Yeah. So Victoria, I'm going to toss this to you.
Okay. Well, as Lisa was mentioning, there is that normal belief that in a reasonable marriage, each person is going to be taking actions to actually grow the property value and really, be preparing and planning for your future. Financial infidelity occurs when one spouse decides to take action and hide it from the other spouse regarding their finances. So this might look like, not telling you about certain investment activities or, funneling money away from the marital estate. And it is incredibly destructive and generally leads to some other type, or indicates that there are other types of abuse or toxic behaviors going on. And so this is really, though, sometimes one of the only areas that you can reconcile some of the abuse that you went through because of all of the documentation involved. Generally, somebody who, is engaging in cheating or gambling, they have impulse control issues. And so they're looking more for immediate gratification, not really caring about the long-term consequences of their actions. And this can be incredibly destructive to your emotional and physical health. Unfortunately, there is no combat pay in marriage, but when there is financial infidelity, the good thing is there is so much documentation involved that you really can map out the narrative and help everybody understand just the scope and the extent of the degradation of the marital assets. So just to recap, financial infidelity looks like secretly spending your partner's money without them knowing, hiding money or debt. I had one case, oh my gosh, this was pretty insane. She was a high-powered gal, and the husband, even though he he had taken more of a house husband role, and that's worked well for their marriage. And even though she was making all the money, he still had full control over their financial assets. And he had a bit of a gambling problem as well as alcohol, and actually started going out and opening credit cards in their jointly held name. And so she had no idea, because he would get the mail every day and conveniently throw out the account statements. So this was a huge discovery when I was building out their marital balance sheet. And it turned out he actually had accumulated $150,000 of debt that she had no idea about. So we were able to put together an analysis and then ask that he, would pay for his share of or her share of the losses that he took out of the community assets to pay for that debt. So it really comes down to documenting and then illustrating how the actions of financial infidelity impacted the marriage, and then navigating that into your divorce settlement proposal. So I think it's also important to talk about the difference between reckless investing and gambling. So for our purposes of this conversation, we are talking about one of my recent cases where the husband went and YOLO'd $50,000 or $100,000 on meme coins, otherwise known, as shit coins, because they're a risky gamble. And so oftentimes we are now having to contend with the modern era. Used to be you had to go get in your car and go to the casino to gamble. Well, these days it has been gamified, and it is so easy at the drop of a hat. You can go on your cell phone, get a sports gambling app, or get Webull or Robinhood, one of these major coin platforms, get a wallet essentially and start investing. But really, we need to determine the difference between what investing is and what gambling truly is. Because, in the Camgar case, the husband's claimed that, being an options trader, I was being mindful, I was having a thoughtful approach. Well, in actuality, he was really much more along the lines of, gambling and not having his behavioral impulses controlled, which then led to the $8 million losses for the marital estate. And so this case highlights the importance of demonstrating the difference between what, stupid money management is compared to truly, behaving against the marital estate and fulfilling that, that requirement of the breach of contract. Okay, so I would like to begin with understanding what gambling is. And so this really, the definition of it is precisely, playing a game of chance and taking risky action for the hope of a desired result. The biggest difference between gambling and investing is in gambling, there is no luck, or there is no skill involved. You put your money on red and then you spin the roulette wheel and you have a 50 chance of winning or losing. There's really nothing you can do to impact the outcome after you've placed your initial bet. Now, with gambling, this is expending money in the hopes that it's actually going to generate a profit. Now, you might not be the one that's earning the money on your own per se. You might give your money to an investor and then they'll take action, but you have a job to conduct due diligence and to ensure that if you do actually place your money into a vehicle, that there is a high likelihood of earning a profit. Gambling, there is no, there is no, how do I want to put it? There is no expectation of profit or motive. Really, it's just a game of chance and skill, or sorry, a game of luck, not really a game of skill. So if something goes awry, that's just how the game is set up. As opposed to investing, there are other materials and actions that you put in place. So there are, you diversify your risk. So you're not just putting all your eggs in one basket and like gambling. So I think it's important to kind of highlight how this kind of plays out in a modern world. So the case that I was working on recently was this gentleman. God bless him, he really got invested in Wall Street bets, or rather the Reddit subreddit Wall Street bets, where they have crypto bros trading and commenting on all the latest crazes, and this creates this environment of intoxicating and excitement. And it is very easy to move away from thoughtful investing, where you have a diversification strategy, where you have different asset classes, and you're not solely putting your eggs in one basket. This mentality of gambling, when it's applied using typical and relevant instruments like meme coins or even cryptocurrency, it can be very debilitating because it's so easily accessible for so many people. You don't have to go through your financial advisor. You can just, YOLO $100 or $1,000 each time, and the losses can get pretty intense. And so in my case, this gentleman, he had gotten really addicted to, it seems like, gambling. He already had some impulse control issues, and then throughout the degradation of the marriage, he started looking to, get his dopamine hits another way. So he started, being on Webull and really investing in shaky coins. And so it kind of culminated with the recent Haktua. And so, in this situation, there are so many quick get rich schemes out there on the internet that what might be promoted as a quality investment is actually, a scam. And that, is so much more complicated, because you have not only the person, your husband or your wife, who's investing in the monies. They're supposed to do a due diligence and make sure that if they're truly investing and not gambling, they need to be making, smart decisions, building, even if it is a new coin, maybe it's, Dogecoin, or it's something that has a little bit more stability. But a lot of these coins, when they change markets, right? So they start off small on like lower exchanges, and then as they grow in more market capitalization and volume, they are then transferred to larger and larger exchanges. I guess the idea is, there's not just one stock market, there's different areas. And so that's where a lot of these traders think they're going to make a huge profit, is when these coins, hit a certain market capitalization and switch to the next. That's when they think they're going to get their big get rich or quick. They think they're going to get rich quick. And so it can really be alluring and addictive. And so with this situation, I like to call him Mr. Putin, he really got so involved and invested in the market changes that before he knew it, ended up spending $500,000 of the marital funds on these really shaky, instruments that really had not a snowball's chance in hell when you look through the view of a financial advisor on if it was going to, generate a return or not. And so as a result, this had dramatically decreased the overall marital estate balance. And my goal as the CDFA on the team was to really build out an analysis that captured all of his trades and losses. And then we were able to add that back into the total marital estate value, and then do an equal division of that. So what ended up with those losses added back in, Mr. Putin was going to be walking away with 30% of the marital estate, while Miss Putin was going to take 70. So you are able to reconcile some of the losses and differences in the long run when you make that divorce settlement proposal, but you absolutely need documentation in order to make it. It is so challenging. There are all of these nuances, even trying to explain it to you guys after practicing a lot, it's a rough go of it because, at the end of the day, having to articulate a, complicated financial matter is really, the burden of the CDFA, because now you have to go and stand on your claim and help the other side understand why he's going to be walking away with, $500,000 instead of a million or two. And so a lot of the times when you are dealing with someone who's engaging in gambling, they have impulse control issues. They're probably emotionally immature. They do not know how to get their needs met in other ways. And oftentimes the divorce is really the first time that they've been told no, or they've had to deal with the consequences of their actions. In the Hawk-Tuah rug pull case, the husband had been hiding all of his behaviors, and he, not only from his wife, but really from himself as well. And when he reviewed my report, it was almost earth-shattering for him because he never even understood the degree that he truly had gambled away all of the marital assets. A lot of these guys get so addicted to that initial bump, right? Because, and really to get hooked in this, you have to have some type of profit at the beginning. Otherwise, they just think maybe I'm never going to be good at this, and they move on to another addiction. But in this situation, he essentially made $27,000 initially, and then blew $500,000 trying to make that back up. And it's so weird to actually drop down into the psychology of losing, because some people, they get so desensitized that they actually chase the losses. It's not about, the thrill and trying to actually produce a profit. And, it's wrapped up in this like, well, this is just investing, no, this is a true impulse control disorder that has destroyed the marital assets. And so it's horrible to be in a position where you have been the victim of a spouse who's engaging in gambling and reckless behavior like this. Because not only do you have to deal with their behavior, there was months when this guy was losing 6 figures. And you could only imagine how miserable he was to be around, right? Because he's concealing, he's lying to himself, he's lying to you, he's lying to the children, he's having to conduct an extra life. And so, not only do you have to live through that, but now as you go through a divorce, unfortunately, I hate to say this, but this process is not fair. It is one of the most arduous things that you are going to have to go through in your life. And so you absolutely have to be working with a good coach that's going to help you navigate some of those feelings of overwhelm, because when you show up, you have to deal with hard situations like this that have far-reaching consequences. So when you're able to really show up and have a good financial analysis, it enables you to have a much better negotiation. Oftentimes, these guys have, larger than life personalities, and they're not used to being told no. So when you then go tell them that, oh, by the way, buddy, you have lost, $500,000 on Hawk-Tuah, this is not right. You hurt not only, us, but your future as well. They can often, they dismiss it, they brush it off. And what I like to do in my analysis is actually build out what if that money, if everything they deposited would have been, preserved and not YOLO'd on red at the casino, what that actually would have added to the marital estate value. In the Hawk-Tuah case, if all of the funds would have been actually invested, they would have had over $3.5 million added into their marital estate. As a result, we're now looking at well, because of his gambling, as a result, now we're looking at a balance sheet that is bare bones. And so unless you build out really what, that financial consequences, you're going to be facing a divorce settlement situation where your balance sheet is sorely missing his funds that he YOLO'd at Wall Street Bets. So the burden is on you. And with that, we are going to kind of dive into how you go about making a claim of dissipation of marital funds.
Okay, so thank you for that, Victoria. And then getting to the legal side of it. So here's some just general notions from the legal perspective. The burden of proof is going to be on the claimant to assert the breach. And the claimant is who's, obviously saying to the court, hey, there's been a breach of fiduciary duties, like in the case of the Hawk Two of Coins. And they're going to have to demonstrate that a fiduciary duty existed, which we know already that there is case in statutory law, including Camgar and Rossi and things like that. And then demonstrate what facts support the existence of the breach, in which case you would probably want to bring in an expert here. And that's what Victoria was speaking to. So how do I quantify what damages I suffered? Well, if Victoria is able to go through and build out, what would have happened if the money had been deposited and preserved and not YOLO'd, which is what she just talked about, then there would have been $3.5 million or something like that, whatever her case was. It turns out that she then can testify as an expert and indicate that that's the money that coulda, woulda, shoulda been there had the breach of fiduciary duty not taken place. And so, we can't just say, hey, there's been a breach. We also have to quantify what that breach is. And that's where an expert comes in to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. So now we're going to kind of dive into how you would actually prepare, your report. So this is what I do day in and day out. Documentation is really going to be your best friend in divorce. This is not easy. It is not fair. And generally, you're building out a report that needs to really adjudicate or, spell out your claim without you being present. And so attorneys are they're fantastic warriors. Their linguistical prowess is parallel to none. But you need to give them evidence that they can then take to court to clearly articulate what is going on. So the burden of proof is going to be on you if you're the person who's making the claim, and documentation is going to be your kryptonite. So you really can, put your future self ahead. Otherwise, you're going to be facing a situation where you're dividing up, a half of the pie when you should be having that full pie in front of you so you can dig in and really present and prepare yourself for the next chapter. Divorce is really tough. And ideally, you can work with your partner, even if you are relatively unamicable, but there's ways to streamline your case so you're not having to spend a ton of money, going back and forth. And so if you are able to get all the discovery documents, if they are using coins and apps, if they're generally trading on their phone, you're going to have to go and ask them to pull down those 1099 forms. But the more documentation that you can really, work with your partner to get, the easier this is going to be. Now, in this situation, chances are there's going to be a level of hostility involved. And so that's where, streamlining communications and having your attorney and CDFA get connected so they can easily communicate and get the right documentation necessary to build your case out is going to be helpful. But this, the burden of proof is on you guys. And so it's going to be really important to, make sure you have every I dotted and every T crossed. So when you are going through and gathering your financial statements, there's a tendency to focus only on getting the account statements, but you need to get the tax reporting statements as well, which are otherwise known as the 1099-B forms. So account statements, these are a snapshot in time. When you're looking at an investment account, And if there's a lot of trading going on, that account statement is going to show all of the trades that have been going on. And this information is helpful because it can give you some insight into what their behaviors would look like. Traditionally with investing, if there's going to be a thoughtful strategy that they have, they're going to be selecting 5, 10, 20 stocks to be watching. And they will have a plan, once it hits this threshold, right, I'm going to buy, 100 shares. So they'll have thoughtful trades. Well, when you're gambling, and like the case with the Haktua coin, this guy was making 25 trades a day sometimes, during the height of his gambling frenzies. His account statements were 20 or 30 pages long because of all of the trades. And so that gives you some insight. Especially if you are dealing with somebody that might already have an addiction history, you can get another expert to testify and really talk about a gambling addiction and how these behaviors indicate that this is not actually an investment strategy, but instead this is an impulse control disorder that went against the benefit of the marital estate. It's very important that you really build as much evidence as you can to illustrate that this, is not typical investing, because this is generally, as Mr. Kamgar tried to make, the claim that these individuals will try to. And it can be artfully unwove, but it's always going to rely on documentation and essentially using their own actions against them. I don't want to say it that way, rather highlighting the behavior that led to the consequences. It is their actions, their financial infidelity that has put you in this position, and that, is horrendous. And now you have to go through and deal with all of these financial statements, so you're almost being re-victimized again. But it's very important to not only rely on the account statements, but get those 1099-B forms. And this is also where it gets complicated. Now, you have to have those tax reporting statements because they will do a better job of outlining all of the gains and losses. If you are solely looking on the tax returns, that's where you can sometimes not gain or not capture all of the data. Because there are certain, it's called like a wash rule. And if you, oh gosh, I don't want to mess it up, but long story short, if you buy or sell a security within 30 days, they'll consider it you replacing your position for a lower tax basis. So you get a better deal in the long run, a better tax deal. If you go outside of that, if like on the 32nd day, you make a trade, well, that, does not get counted in as the wash rule, and then those trades and those trade related taxes get added to your statement or deducted. And so if it's in the wash rule, you'll have to pay tax on it. If it's not, there's some, you can start playing around with capital gains and other type of taxation considerations. So this is where it gets super complicated, and not only, and you have to get those 1099-Bs and not just look at the tax return, because how you do income tax accounting is not the same for how you do divorce financial analysis. These are two different worlds. And so after you are able to really go through and get those 1099-B forms, you're now ready to start building out your loss calculation. So you'll have to go through essentially and grab all of the losses and gains and to highlight what the total value of the gambling addiction was. Now you take that information and you plug that into your marital balance sheet. And just to review, your marital balance sheet is going to have all of your assets and debts that you accumulated during the marriage, but then also all of the separate property. Because going back to that lottery case, that's a famous case. It's a horrible situation, seriously, I think, where, and I think Lisa could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the wife, they had almost gone through the entire divorce settlement, and she thought she was going to get away with not disclosing. And I think they actually ended up settling. And then the husband saw that she was living a high life and couldn't quite understand how she was able to quit her job, but she had a new car and all the bells and whistles and a new house. And so he started to dig around and I think uncovered that she had been a part of a lottery pool in the office, and it turned out that they actually won. She failed to disclose during the divorce process, and then he took her back. The judge was so appalled, he actually threw the book at her and ended up awarding her husband all of the lottery earnings. So this is where disclosing, even if it is separate, it's always better to err on the side of caution, because you don't want to be in that position of Miss Rossi, where she's now having, what's worse than having won the lottery? Probably having have lost it. So being mindful with how you present your data is going to be very important. And having the total value of the marital estate is going to be really your raison d'etre. You need to figure out what your current marital value is, and then you add back in all of those gambling losses. And ideally, you should be working with a CDFA to project what those funds would have been if they had actually been properly invested. So that's really important. Otherwise, you could be in a position where you're now having to split the marital estate after the losses. And that is, just wrong. And, you have to advocate for yourself. You only have one chance really to get this right. To go through a divorce is probably going to cost you, about 5 figures. Who knows? If you're able to do some things yourself and be amicable, it might be lower, but generally divorce is going to be anywhere from, I would say, gosh, 15 to on up. Each case has its own intrinsic differences. So the more that you take this process seriously and build out your final settlement, you're going to have a much more streamlined process, because you don't want to have to go back through and repay all of the same professionals again to capture, the data. That's not how this is done. It's not easy, but you need to do it methodically and build out a very detailed report that you can then stand on. Everything has documentation, attached to it. Therefore, you should have no problem getting all of the necessary information to build out your divorce impact analysis report.
So Victoria, if I could just jump in right there, it's perfect segue. So in terms of building out all of the documents that the financial expert needs, oftentimes in the legal realm, we can also help with that process by formal discovery or informal discovery. So with formal discovery process, we can issue subpoenas. And I mean, you can, correct me if I'm wrong, but to discover these wallets, the digital wallets, you might have an ability to get that information from an exchange, or maybe you can ask your spouse to disclose anything, or you can just go after it in a subpoena process. I don't know exactly how it would work with NFTs, tokens, etc., but there are definite, subpoenas that we could issue, and in terms of depositions can be taken. I'm not really sure about access to the wallets, right? Because I've been told that if it's on an exchange, it's pretty easy to find it, but it's possible that they're just more of like public wallets. Do you have any sort of insight in how, is it easy to get that stuff or not so easy?
Well, it depends on the situation, really. And it's always going to be the person that's holding the keys to the kingdom that you really have to deal with, because the obligation is on them. And if they are not working with you, then you'll have to go through the subpoena process. But figuring out the right exchange, that can be challenging. But then also some of with crypto and NFTs and these newer digital tokens, a lot of these markets and let's say call them wallets are overseas, and they're not subject to US jurisdiction. So that can sometimes make it more challenging then to get those companies to supply or to agree to a subpoena. Conversely, you send a subpoena to Charles Schwab, they have an entire legal team that handles that day in and day out. They know the system, they know the process. But, one of these smaller exchanges, they'll probably tell you, come back next week, and maybe, they'll have moved shop. So a lot of these smaller exchanges can present challenges. That's where, if you're not able to really figure out where the assets are, you can always go back to the bank statements and see, when you make a transaction out of your bank, it'll have the last 4 of the account that it was sent to on that line. And so you just start building your evidence. Unfortunately, sometimes you are still going to end up with unknowns in the analysis, but you construct as much information as you can, and then you set it at the feet of the other person and say, this is what I've done, please provide this amount of information so I can complete my report. And if they choose not to, that's when they can, have the contempt of court and, sanctions put against them. And I think Lisa might be able to talk better about what occurs if they don't comply with the subpoena request or the documents or the productions to request or the requests, the production
To
requests.
produce.
Yes.
Yes, so yeah, we could definitely file a motion and to compel or to seek sanctions, et cetera, or even have like issue sanctions, issue preclusion. There's just a whole multitude of tools in our tool bag once we know that there's some kind of evasion going on there. But it's interesting because I think one of the things you're pointing out here is that as a financial expert, you could go through like even a basic Schwab statement and do a tracing analysis and see where monies are being deposited and amounts, right? So, I mean, you're playing financial detective in essence for the client who may not really know the full extent of what's going on. So how would a client know going through a divorce that there is even crypto? Because I find there are clients who don't even have any awareness that this is being done. And so like, would you generally say, hey, let me look at some of your financial statements, or, what do you suspect? I mean, how do you get to the bottom of that as the detective?
Well, it's kind of a twofold process. Generally, nothing is done in a vacuum. And so somebody will have heard something about some account. They might not know where it's at, but that kind of alerts us at least to be on the lookout for it. But a lot of the times, if you think that there's some type of financial infidelity going on, what we do is we get all of that person, their bank account statements, and then we look specifically for the transaction in and out of the account. Generally, there's going to be income coming in from somewhere, and then they'll have to disperse the monies to their other accounts. And that's where we start to dig in and kind of start to unweave this web. But unfortunately, there is no like US database or on your tax returns, you don't actually list out all of your assets. So oftentimes with crypto, what you have to do is you just ask you ask the other person and hope that they actually comply. Otherwise, you go back through, as long as it's been within the last 7 years, your financial institutions are legally required by the IRS to obtain the last 7 years of documents. But after that, that's where you kind of get into a gray area where maybe they have really good indexing and digitizing, but they're not, generally required to. So oftentimes after 7 years, they clear out those records. So you really try to get all of your ducks in a row in the initial stages. And then as these investments kick out income, or if they are actually generating interest, a 1099-B form will be produced. And so you kind of begin going through the account statements, and then the tax returns. They're a good place to begin, but you absolutely, that's kind of like your treasure map that has some of the the instructions kind of rubbed off. You have to then kind of do a little bit more detective work. So it's not a streamlined process by any means, and it is a little bit like, looking for a diamond in a rough, but it is doable as long as you have a good divorce team working with you. And, I cannot stress enough, you are going to encounter uncomfortable financial feelings because, we grow up in a capitalistic society that doesn't really educate us on how money works. And then we add in our, money thoughts and beliefs that our parents gave us, and then that we've learned as adults. And you kind of get this rocky seas already to begin with. And now you're wading into a divorce. So it is just natural to have really overwhelming feelings as you're navigating this. So working with a CDFA and a divorce coach, really, that is a great pair because you're able to work through your negative emotions and then also have the financial facts so you can show up truly as your best and most put together self and have the evidence you need to engage with your attorney and to properly negotiate with your partner.
Yeah, and I would also add to that too, one thing that we haven't talked about, which is e-discovery. It's possible to also do electronic discovery where we can get like a cold copy of the hard drive on computers. We can look at apps that have been downloaded by the other spouse. I mean, we definitely could also use forensic computer, IT type investigators and look at the transaction records and all of that. And I would imagine too, one other thing that we grapple with that I'm not really feeling too expert in here, but like the valuation and tracking, right? Because there's ways to price out where we are in terms of the values of these, like the blockchain, the values of some of these items. And I would imagine too that there are experts in this area who could probably help with that.
Well, I think, you always have to go back to what is your date of separation, when were the coins purchased, and what is your current value, because if you're looking to do any type of valuation, if it is, a marital asset, you generally use the date of separation balance. However, if there's no like additional contributions, and this is solely a marital property account that doesn't have any other contributions post separation in it, well, if that account balance rises, then that should be used what is on, that most current value should be what's on your marital balance sheet. However, if those accounts are separate property assets post separation, that's when you use the date of separation value. And so it kind of, you end up with a marital balance sheet, and you should always have the separation value or this date of separation value, as well as, any ongoing or updated valuations as a part of your financial report. There are so many components to it. So, just being mindful that you can do this. It is going to be complicated, but there's the right expert for every stage. And I think Lisa was so that was brilliant. Doing an e-discovery is probably going to be the best way if your husband or wife has, YOLO'd all of your money on crypto or meme coins, whatever it is. You really, have to put some effort and energy into this type of discovery. If they have, if they're lying in one area of their life, they probably will continue to lie to you throughout the divorce. And so you always need to get the documentation. And that's where you can really highlight how their actions have created this decrease of the marital funds that have now put you in this position. So building your case out using those discovery documents, that's going to be the surest way for you to streamline this process.
One other thing there, Victoria, that we might mention to anyone listening is that if you want to do this the right way and not end up in the sanctions zone or issue preclusions or any of that. So maybe think about getting your spouse's consent, like in the Camguard case, get your spouse's consent, especially if it's for crypto or some other sort of dicier investment, and keep records. And whatever you get consent for, make sure that you get ongoing consent for additional investments. Don't take the ground and say, well, I got consent for, the first 2.5 million. So if I take another 5.5, what the heck, it's okay. I can do that. Make sure that don't rationalize that in your head. Get your consent for additional investments. Be transparent in your disclosures, right? Because we're trying to keep you out of the zone of getting sanctioned for these things. Just whatever you can do to avoid the sanctions would include things like, hey, let me voluntarily show you those records that you're now asking for. Let me give you the material facts and information concerning investments, and we don't have to go play, hey, let's hire an investigator and hide the ball. Instead, we're going to, be upfront and put the monies out there so everybody knows what we're dealing with. So we're all working from the same financial statements. That's going to be a lot better than having to, kind of do everything that we've been talking about, is dealing with, dissipation and waste of community and being in the zone of like, concealment leading to like a loss of all of your lottery proceeds. So yeah, just things to think about to do it the right way and not to get in the hot water that we've just been describing.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. It was truly a pleasure to share with you a little bit about my most recent case. If you are facing a dissipation of marital funds claim, please know that you do not have to go through this alone. Building out your divorce team so you have a strong legal strategist, a CDFA, and a divorce coach to help you navigate this is going to help you show up truly as your best self so you can have a high quality of divorce experience. There are so many things that you can do to prepare for this situation so you're not caught holding the bag. And with that, Lisa, I'll send it back to you if there's anything else.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. This was really eye-opening, and it's always good to hear about ways in the crypto world and just in general with any sort of financial gambling of how to protect yourself. And I think that this is, a good foundation for people to get started on, thinking about, when they need to hire a team and what we're looking for. And I think that, you've given some really good insights here for people. This is a new emerging field. So I thank you for that. And I hope that we've also been able to convince people to try and keep things on the up and up and be a little proactive and prophylactically just kind of make sure that they're, meeting their fiduciary obligations so as to avoid the hot mess that we've been talking about. But feel free to reach out to any of us. And thank you so much today, Victoria, for your, for your good presentation and your time.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And I just want to reiterate that this is not specific legal or financial advice. If you are facing this situation, I do suggest that you reach out to Lisa or I. We can give you a consultation and help you figure out your best next steps. Divorce is challenging, but you do not have to go through this alone. With
Great.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. I look forward to seeing you guys on the flip side.
Thank you.